Hello and welcome to another episode of the Gritty Hour. I have a very special guest today, Dixiane Hallaj, who is the widow of Muhammed Hallaj, who wrote a book called Unfolding the Arab-Israel Conflict, 1894 to 1970. Dixiane is, as I said, his widow and publisher of this book. So welcome to the Gritty Hour.
Thank you, Tom. It's good to be here. Thank you
You.
for the opportunity.
So, when did your husband pass away, first of all?
A little over 7 years ago,
7 years. And the book's been out for how long?
since November.
Uh-huh. So you took it as a mission to get this book out and published.
Yes.
Um, when did he finish the book? Do you know when this book was? The reason
Uh,
why I'm asking is because it has specific year 1894 to specific year 1970, so I'm curious.
right. Well, what happened is he finished the book and then we went overseas and he taught first in Jordan for 5 years, and then we had the opportunity to teach at Birzeit University
Hmm.
on the West Bank.
Hmm.
And it would not have been advisable for him to have published it
Right.
because we were there on a visitor's permit.
I see. Okay. So for to use the term security reasons, you decided not to publish it at that time.
Right, so that we wouldn't be told to leave.
Understood, understood.
Right.
So, but it was a completed book at the time.
It was completed, it was ready to go and send out,
Hmm.
and we kind of forgot about it.
I see. Okay.
And then when everything started in October of 23,
Hmm.
I just felt so helpless
Right.
watching what was going on.
Hmm.
And I started going through his papers that I couldn't bring myself to do it before that. And I rediscovered it. And it became something I really wanted to do. And then as the violence got worse and worse, I sort of had to do it.
So
Became a
you were
mission.
compelled to get it out there.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about the book itself. Well, tell us a little bit first about Muhammad.
He was he was part of the Palestine National Council, but he wasn't appointed to that until after we returned to the United States. We taught on the West Bank for 7 years. We came as a sabbatical.
Hmm.
He was a visiting professor at Harvard. And then, as I said earlier, we were only there on visitors permits, even though he was born and grew up on the West Bank. He wasn't physically present in 1967. He was in this country studying, getting his PhD.
Hmm.
So he never got a residency permit, and they would not grant it.
I see. So, but he was a scholar and he was a professor.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes,
And he did most of his teaching. Did he do some of the teaching here in the United States as well?
yes, yes. He taught at the University of Jacksonville University in Florida for a
I see.
while.
Hmm. All right. So, if you could just tell us a little bit about what this, obviously, the title tells you what it's about, but give us a little insight of what the book's about.
Well, he was born in mandated Palestine, and with the British involved, and so he was um, present for. He was a young teenager when the Nakba happened, and so many people were terrorized into leaving the country.
Mm.
And it made that his life's work, to make sure that as many people as possible learned what actually happened, because our media over here does not always give both sides of the story.
Right. We do get the Israeli side of the story more than we get the flip
Yes,
side of that. Yeah.
and both political parties have supported Israel since its inception.
Hmm.
So the Palestinian point of view has been lacking.
Right. So, because to your point about one-sided stories, a lot of people in this country would think the Troubles, if you would, I'm an Irishman, so I have to use that term, um, started in 48, 1948, with the creation of the State of Israel, correct? And the book itself goes back to 1894. Could you enlighten us a little bit about what happened during that time period?
Yes,
Yeah.
in 1894 was the trial, the Dreyfus trial. Dreyfus was an officer in the French army, and he was wrongly accused of treason. And in those days, anti-Semitism or anti-other, it wasn't just against, anybody who was different was suspect.
Mm.
And so Theodor Herzl was a reporter, an Austrian reporter who happened to be Jewish, and he was sent to France to cover the trial. And he was waiting in the huge crowd of people that were out on the streets waiting for the verdict to be announced. And when they announced the guilty verdict, the crowd sort of turned into a mob and began chanting things like kill the Jews,
Mm.
believing that they were more loyal to their own people than they were to France or to the country they were living in.
Right.
And this had a profound effect on him, because he knew that if he'd said something and, they were in such a state that he feared for his life.
Mm.
And he decided that Jews would never be safe living among Gentiles.
Mm. So,
And
yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
so he made it his mission to do something about this.
Hmm. Well, I was going to ask, who laid claim to that territory in the late 1800s?
The Ottoman Empire.
So like what would be now Turkey?
Right. But of course, it was an empire, the same as the British Empire was. And it was a time of empires, the Austro-Hungary Empire.
Hmm.
And they had a lot of power, and things were different. And so the Ottoman Empire was sort of losing its grip, and it was being called the sick man of Europe. And that's went into World War I. And at that point, the British and the French made a secret agreement, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and they just took a map and a ruler and drew a line and said, okay, France, you can govern this, and Britain will govern this. And the third major ally at that point was Russia. And they'll be fine because they're getting Armenia and all the stands. And, that's how we'll divvy up the land.
This was at the end of World War One, correct?
Right. Actually, it wasn't even the end yet.
Mm.
They were still fighting.
Hmm.
But this was a secret agreement. and nobody knew about it until later. And so the British, meanwhile, went off and talked to the Arabs. And I don't know if you ever seen the movie Lawrence of Arabia,
Yes.
but he went and they promised the Arabs their independence if they would harass the Turks and weaken them, because they would have to send in people to calm the unrest, and there was sabotage with trains and shipments of arms and supplies and stuff. So the Arabs held up their side of the agreement. And then in the meantime, Herzl was talking to the European Jews, and he made a very powerful friend of Lord Rothschild. And between them, they got Lord Balfour to make the Balfour Declaration. Lord Balfour had been a prime minister, but he was the foreign minister when he wrote the Balfour Declaration
Foreign Minister of Great Britain at the time.
of the Brit, yes,
Yeah.
of Britain,
Mhm.
and the whole declaration is, I've got it on one side of a 3x5 card.
Wow.
It's one sentence,
Mhm.
and if I have your permission, I'd like to read it.
Absolutely, yeah.
It says, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of that object. This is the part that everybody remembers, but what they don't remember is the second clause. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country.
Mhm.
That's the entirety of the Balfour Declaration.
And what year was that Balfour Declaration for?
It was 1917, November 2nd.
And at the time, what is now considered Palestine was a territory or a possession of the British Empire.
Well, the British Empire got the mandate once they were successful in World War One.
Mhm. Yeah.
They were right.
So this declaration, even then, even though I was taught it was in 1948, but even then, in post-World War One, which would be 1918, as
Right.
memory serves.
So all of these things were happening, and as somebody said in a later commission, there were so many commissions that were sent to study the thing. They said, well, they've clearly sold the same horse twice,
Mm,
because they promised the Arabs their independence, and there was a rebellion, and and they promised the Jews a national home, which was deliberately vague.
mm,
They didn't promise them a nation apart. They just promised them a place.
right. Well, the
Wasn't there
surrounding, go ahead. Yeah, the surrounding territories of what is now Palestine, like Egypt and
Jordan,
Jordan, were,
Syrian, Lebanon? Yeah.
were they all created? The states themselves created uh, after World War One, as the Ottoman Empire.
Jordan was,
Mhm.
and it was governed by the Hashemites, which it still is. The king is a Hashemite, because they were the very influential family in Saudi Arabia that claim direct descendants from the prophet. And they were the ones that they had made the argument, or the agreement for their own freedom.
Mhm. And what about Egypt at the same time, or?
No, Egypt was a different, I think Egypt was not part of the Ottoman Empire.
Oh, it was not. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay.
If I'm wrong on that, somebody I'm sure will correct us.
Yeah, that's all right. Yeah, I'm not sure either. I'm just curious, because I'm trying to get because I know all this is covered in the book, so I'm trying to get uh, um, a little clarity as to when, because I know after the Holocaust, after World War II, um, was when the actual creation of Israel took place, correct?
Right. That's they began to accept, the British allowed immigration of tens of thousands of people. And mainly because the European countries didn't want to accept them, so they
The
were glad to.
Jewish people that were in Europe at the time, you mean?
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah. And of course, that the Holocaust was just a horrible, horrible thing. And they, to this day, are using it as they're still playing the victim from
Hmm.
that.
Hmm. So between World War One and World War Two, or prior to World War Two, uh, who occupied Palestine? Who claimed ownership of it, and who were the people living there at the time in that interim between the two world wars?
Okay, Britain was ruling the country
Hmm.
as a mandate. And according to the Charter of the League of Nations, a mandate is their mission is to prepare the people for self-government. They did not do this.
Hmm.
Instead, they allowed all the any immigration by Jews in such numbers that the country, which was not empty, it was densely populated at the time
By whom, though, for the most part?
by Palestinians.
Okay.
I mean, in Arabic, the word Palestine is Philistine.
Hmm.
And in the Old Testament, when Moses came out of Egypt, he conquered the Philistines. And these are the same people that are still living there.
Hmm.
You know, that Israel conquered them the first time, and now they're trying to do the same, but they didn't hold on to it really very long
Right.
because Rome came and.
Hmm. So in the interim, post World War One, pre World War Two, the Palestinians had a what, 1,000 years or 5,000 years of claim to that territory, even though it is in the League of Nations, England was recognized as the owner of the territory.
Well, a mandate isn't really an owner, they're kind of a guardian,
Hmm.
but they act like owners.
Hmm. Hmm. Right.
So,
So
and
then
it
came
was
World War
years
Two.
because
Yeah.
Palestine is right there at the Suez Canal.
Hmm.
And the Suez Canal was the gateway to India. And at the time, India was the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. And so England wanted to be sure that the Suez Canal was always safe for them to transport whatever back and forth, to have clear passage to India.
Right.
And they just pulled out, oddly enough, the same year that India gained independence. And they no longer needed that.
Hmm. I understand. That was in 40, well, that was post World War Two as well.
Yes.
Yeah. So World War Two, we're talking about you explain who owned, who lived there, who owned it in the interim between World War One and World War Two. World War Two comes along, and the Palestinians are still there. Um, and then I think it was 47 or 48, I believe 48.
Yeah.
Uh, Whatever the governing jurisdiction was, decided to give a
And
certain piece of the
yeah,
territory to
when
the
Britain pulled out, they sort of said, okay, the United Nations, you take it, we can't do anything with it.
right. So it
You
was
know,
the United Nations uh, charter or so that turned a certain portion of Palestine, what is now
so
Palestine, over.
they came up with a partition plan.
Uh-huh. That's what
Now,
if you could
when
explain
this
that.
started, land ownership, there was 10% of the land of Palestine was owned by Jews.
Hmm.
I mean, there's always been a community of Jewish people in Jerusalem and around those places. And they're there to this day. That and that community does not recognize the state of Israel.
Hmm.
And they come to all the demonstrations and of freeing Palestine because their position is that yes, there's when the second coming happens, then the Jews will have Israel, but that's up to God and not up to people and guns.
Hmm. So, but in fact, a portion of what is now Palestine was, or what is now Israel, was given to
Right.
a Jewish organization to export people that were Holocaust survivors into Israel.
It was to be to accept any Jew that wanted to come. Yes.
Okay, not
But
just
they were
not just
given
European Jews.
56% of the land.
Mm,
But by the time the fighting stopped, they had 77% of the land.
mm.
And now, of course, they have it all.
Yeah, well, we'll actually get to that chronologically, hopefully, but just so I understand, the state of Israel was formed in 1948,
Yes. Or,
and as you said, they enabled immigration from all ports, all.
yeah, and the immigration started in in the earlier, but it didn't really get massive proportions until after World War II.
Right. So I think the majority of them did come from Europe, but they were from
Yes.
Africa. There were Jews from all over the world, really, that
Yeah,
emigrated
there
to
were.
what was that partition, what was given them from the United Nations. But at the time, there was a delineation where the Palestinians still had Palestine. So I guess the question is, when did the encroachment start? If that's a good word to use.
Wow.
In other words, where the Jews started encroaching in where the Palestinians were.
Well, I mean, they started in the 30s. They started with their immigration, and they started with terrorizing people. Actually, there are Walid Khalidi wrote a lovely book, but there are 532, I think, villages that were completely destroyed. I mean, like, you see the foundations.
Mhm.
There's a park in Israel called Canada Park, and I think there are 4 or 5 villages that you can still see the foundations.
Canada Village,
Canada Park.
Canada Park. I'm
It's
sorry.
a park, really.
Yeah. Wonder how it got the name Canada Park.
I'm assuming Canada donated money.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, that's usually how parks get their names, right? Or stadiums, whatever. So, so post-World War II is what I'd like to focus on now. So from 1948, I guess the first settlement of European Jews started
No,
getting into.
coming in. They'd been coming in,
Mhm.
and they had armed, and they actually called them gangs
Mm.
that were going around the country and spreading fear and terror and um, the people were mainly subsistence farmers. You know, they weren't armed, they weren't warriors, they didn't know what to do, and they left. They were terrified, especially after there were massacres, the most famous of which was Dixiane,
Mhm.
where they just came in and massacred every living being.
Mm. So I guess from 48, go ahead, Dixie Ann.
Yeah, so people left,
Hmm.
you know, and they kept thinking, okay, you know, in a few months or a few weeks, the politicians will figure it all out and we can go home again.
And then they kick the
Where
can down
that
the
got
road a
them.
little bit, yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess my question now is, because I know this is all covered in the book, so I just wanted to give people an idea of what's in the book. Um, what, so I guess when the original Holocaust survivors, for want of a better term, or European Jews emigrated to what is now Israel, um, I guess the growth, did that stop after a while, or did the growth of just the population on its own organically grow?
I think there's still recruiting new people who move, immigrate into Israel, Jews from other countries. They get huge tax breaks. They get, you know, subsidized housing. They get help finding jobs.
Mhm.
And they make it very attractive.
So I guess the underlying problem is the need for space, living
Right,
space,
right,
and so it's kind of pushing the envelope, so to speak, into what was Palestine became
right.
smaller and smaller.
And all of the people, the refugees, they still have the deeds, they still have the keys to their houses, which don't exist anymore.
Mhm.
You know, it's stolen land.
Mm. And the onset, I guess, when did the Palestinian pushback start? Like, what's the origins of, like, I remember when I was a kid, the PLO, today it's Hamas. When did those organizations start to form?
Probably around, I think the first time the PLO did anything noteworthy was like in 56, the Battle of Karami.
Mhm.
And, you know, and people tried in the 40s to defend their land. I mean, in Muhammad's town of Kolkalia, the women gave their marriage gold so that they had a committee of men that went off to Egypt to try and buy guns so they could defend themselves. And, and it was pretty horrific. They came back. My husband tells this as a first person story because he was there.
Right,
And he said they came back with these sacks of old guns that the Bedouins had dug up in the desert from World War One.
mhm.
And, you know, they were choked with sand. Some of them never worked. And the ammunition didn't fit quite right. I mean, it was pretty sad.
Right. In the I forget what it, exactly what year. I don't even want to say because I could be well wrong. I think it was in the 1960s. They had the 7 Day War,
67.
67.
Yeah, June
Um,
7.
can you tell us a little bit about what caused that and how did the surrounding countries, as we spoke about, Egypt and Jordan, how did they all get themselves involved in that, in the Palestinian cause, so to speak?
Well, the partition plan to begin with was an unjust, giving more than half of a country to people that own 10% is not exactly justice. And then they took another 25%. So the other countries wanted to show that they understood that this was wrong and they wanted to help. And they did send soldiers, but there was no unified command. And the soldiers had to follow orders that were given from their home country. And that never works because they're not on the ground. And Palestine had no army.
Right, except for maybe the PLO, which was a resistance group essentially, not
It
geared
was
to a mass war, right?
right.
Yeah. So, what do you know? What kind of allegiances and ties were formulated to get those countries to support the Palestinians?
No, I just I just assumed that, like if you see somebody beating somebody up on the street, don't you go over and say, hey, what's going on?
Hmm.
How come you're beating this little kid up?
Hmm.
I
Yeah,
don't know.
yeah. No, I was just curious if there was any kind of an agreement between the.
Well, there is such a thing as the League of Arab States,
Hmm.
and it's probably similar to NATO with, a mutual defense pact. I don't know.
Okay, but given the time frame of the 7 Days War, do you think that's one of the instigators in getting uh, your husband to begin writing this book?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. Um,
Yes.
yeah, being a Palestinian, he probably was prompted, and a scholar, he was probably well positioned to write this book.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the sources that he does give personal glimpses of what he witnessed during the Nakba, and the sources that he quotes are mostly UN observers and people who are there, and the vast majority of them began to serve because they wanted to help Israel.
Hmm.
I mean, everybody had heard about the Holocaust.
Right,
And by the time they left, they had they were totally different.
right, I understand. Do you mind if I share the book? I know it's available on Amazon, and if you don't mind, I'd like to share the Amazon page with
That was very
the
nice.
folks that are listening to, watching us, excuse me, on YouTube. I'll show it to you in a second. And for those who are listening to us on Spotify or Apple or wherever you listen to the podcast, there'll be a link to the Amazon page in the show notes. So just look below the show notes, and you can check out the book on Amazon. So that's why I wanted to get that out of my head. And just bear with me 1 second. So I don't know if you can see that, Dixiane, on your end there.
Yes.
So this is the book, and it just came out this past November, And so your husband, Muhammad Hallaj, wrote the book back in 1971, I believe, or 72.
Around that time, yes.
Hmm. So
I'm
that's why that explains the dates 1894 to 1970.
right.
So none of the modern events are in the
I
book.
I've put in some footnotes that I'd said editor's note, because he gives statistics that, of course, are very wrong now.
I see. Okay.
That, a million Palestinians have been displaced. Well, now it's more like 3 million.
Oh, I see. Okay. You would have to update those.
So I've done that in the form of editor's notes. I
Right.
have not changed the manuscript itself.
Right. Okay. So
And by the way, it's also available in bookstore.org.
bookstore.org. I'll also say what I've said to on occasion. I have people at bookstore.org. I have people that have written books, and I say, to my audience, if you want to go into your local bookstore, even if they don't have the book, ask the person at the bookstore that you want that book. They will order the book for you.
Yes,
99% of the time,
ebook
that
is
bookstore will order the book for you.
the ebook is also available from Barnes and Noble online.
Hmm.
But if you walk into a Barnes and Noble, they will order it
I
from
see.
Inger's Park, which is
So you,
where.
did your husband intend to publish the book when he wrote it back in the 70s, early 70s?
Yes, he intended to, but then when we went overseas, it wasn't, there was no internet,
Hmm.
so it would have been, you would send a physical copy of the book
To a publisher.
to a publisher with a self-addressed stamped envelope if you wanted it back.
Hmm.
And I don't even know how you would do that from one country to another, because you can't put American postage on you can't buy it from there. So
Right.
I
It
don't
was a,
know.
it was a different time, a
Yeah,
different age. Things were just done differently
right.
back then. But it's been well received since you came out with it in November, correct?
Yes,
I know you have some really good reviews on them down below. And it gives what I always say, the other side of the coin. Like every story has two sides to it, and it's like a divorce. You hear the wife's side, and you think that's the side until you hear the husband's side, and somewhere in the middle is the truth. So from my point of view as an American, I always like to see two sides of the coin, and we don't really get both sides of the coin here in the United States for various reasons, which makes this a valuable book to have, I think, if you want to hear the other side of the story, if you want.
thank
So,
you.
um, all those years between the early 70s and November, I know your husband passed away 7 years ago. It took a couple of years, I guess, for you to just, as his widow, just to get up the courage to go through his stuff.
Right.
Yeah. And then you came across this manuscript that you probably remember when was writing it, because you were married for 50 something years, right?
55 years, yes.
God bless you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
I
yeah. And then you read through the manuscript again and said, well, this is important. I have to get this out.
I did. And since then I've been putting out a weekly newsletter, not weekly, but about that, 1 or 2 weeks between them.
right,
And I've been doing it. He did, when we came back to this country, he started a magazine that he published for about 10 years. And so I'm taking articles from that and saying, this is what was done 40 years ago, and it's being done again.
right.
And anybody who goes to my website, which is Sage Tea Books,
Hmm.
can sign up for it, or I also have it on Substack.
Right. Well, what people should know about you, Dixiane, is you're a published author yourself. I think that your biggest
Yes.
book was a book called Born a Refugee, a novel of one Palestinian family. And what I like is you have a Weebly page which helps people who want to become self-publishers or want to get into publishing themselves, and writers tips, which was, I think a great thing that you do.
Right. I also have a blog about Dixie Helps Writers,
Mhm.
but I don't do that very often now. I have now switched. Pretty much my focus is the Palestine problem, and
Right. Well, I can understand that, especially nowadays.
yeah.
I have to ask you before I let you go, Dixie Ann. Well, first of all, you born in America?
Yes.
Yeah. And were you born in the southern part of America?
Yeah.
Your first name is not one that you hear every day. So Dixie Ann, it's
I
almost
know my mother liked it so much she changed her own name
to Dixie Ann?
to Dixie Ann.
Ah,
Yeah.
well, that's great. Yeah. What part of the country were you born in? What state?
Virginia.
Oh, Virginia. Okay. And that's
But
where
my
you're at
dad
now.
was military, so we didn't live here very long
Hmm.
until
You like
around.
the state though?
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, before I let you go though, I was going to ask you, what do you think about Trump's idea to take over Gaza?
It didn't work last time and it won't work this time.
Yeah. I have no idea what is. It sounded off the. It sounded a little off the nut there. I don't know. You know,
Yeah.
he wasn't very detailed. He just said we should go in there and take it over, and whatever. But I don't know. Very interesting times we live in, Dixie Ann.
Yeah. And a little bit scary.
So I'm 114 years old, and my whole life I've been looking for some sort of peaceful solution in the Middle East, especially in Palestine. So who knows? Let's hope in our lifetimes we get to something. You know,
I hope so.
I still remember Carter Reagan and Sadat shaking hands. That was a lifetime ago, right there. So
It was.
yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for being on. And again, the name of the book is Unfolding the Arab-Israeli Conflict, 1894 to 1970, written by Muhammed Hallaj and published by his wife, Dixiane Hallaj. And we certainly appreciate you coming on today, Dixiane.
Thank you.
And it
Uh,
was a great pleasure to have you on to hear, as I say, both sides of the story. And I wish you great success for the book.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Right.